Standing Rock Agency, Dakota Territory, 1880. While government agents rushed to build proper log cabins before winter, the Lakota families refused to abandon their buffalo hide tipis. Indian agent James McLaughlin called it stubborn foolishness. Military engineers at nearby Fort Keogh dismissed the hide-covered poles as wholly inadequate for civilized winter habitation. They built regulation barracks with 12-inch log walls and massive stone fireplaces. The Lakota erected 18-foot diameter teepees with double-layer buffalo hide and flexible lodge pole frameworks. Settlers mocked them as primitive tents. Then January 1881 arrived. Temperatures plummeted to 47 below zero and stayed there for 6 consecutive weeks. 4 feet of snow, winds howling at 35 miles per hour. McLaughlin's properly built cabin became uninhabitable, ice forming on inside walls 3 feet from his roaring fireplace. Fort Keogh soldiers huddled around stoves, burning 8 cords of wood weekly while still shivering at 34 degrees. But inside those mocked teepees, Lakota families stayed comfortable at 68 degrees, using 1/3 the fuel of any cabin. What did Plains tribes understand about thermal dynamics, structural engineering, and winter survival that 5 centuries of European building wisdom had completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The thermometer outside Fort Keogh read 46 degrees below zero on the morning of February 15th, 1887. Inside the regulation military barracks, soldiers huddled around a cast iron stove that had been roaring since before dawn, yet the air temperature barely reached 34 degrees. Frost covered the inside walls despite the structure's 12-inch chinked log construction and stone foundation that Army engineers had designed according to standard frontier specifications. The men burned through 8 cords of split oak weekly, yet still woke each morning to find their water buckets frozen solid and their breath visible in white puffs throughout the day. 50 yards away, smoke rose steadily from a 20-foot diameter Lakota teepee, where Chief Gall's family had established their winter camp. Inside that buffalo hide shelter, the temperature held steady at 68 degrees. Children played on buffalo robes spread across the ground while adults worked comfortably without heavy coats. The contrast was so stark that it defied everything Euro-American settlers thought they understood about winter survival architecture. James McLaughlin had arrived at Standing Rock Agency 4 years earlier with firm convictions about proper housing. As Indian agent, he carried the federal government's mandate to transition Plains tribes from their traditional dwellings to permanent log cabins that reflected civilized standards. McLaughlin came from farming communities in Minnesota and Ontario, where thick-walled structures with massive fireplaces represented the pinnacle of cold-weather construction. His own cabin featured 16 by 20-foot dimensions, walls built from 12-inch chinked logs, and a stone fireplace that consumed 6 cords of wood monthly, yet still left bedroom corners hovering near 35 degrees on cold nights. The government housing program he administered followed standard frontier wisdom: permanent beat portable, heavy beat light. European methods beat indigenous techniques. McLaughlin coordinated with military engineers to establish construction specifications that would demonstrate American superiority through sheer material mass. Log walls must measure at least 8 inches thick. Stone foundations must extend below frost line. Fireplaces must be built large enough to heat entire structures through brute force heat generation. From his perspective, the Lakota family's continued reliance on teepees represented dangerous obstinacy. These were temporary expedients, nothing more than buffalo hide tents stretched over wooden poles. How could rational people trust their lives to such flimsy construction when proper cabins offered solid protection? McLaughlin documented his concerns in detailed reports to Washington, describing indigenous housing as wholly inadequate for civilized winter habitation and recommending immediate transition to permanent structures that would advance the civilization process. Military engineers at Fort Keogh shared McLaughlin's dismissive attitude toward native building methods. These career officers brought standardized construction knowledge from Eastern installations where regulation barracks had proven adequate for moderate winter conditions. They calculated thermal efficiency based on wall thickness and fireplace size, concluding that Tipis offered insufficient insulation against Montana's severe climate. Single-layer buffalo hide walls appeared laughably inadequate compared to solid timber construction. The conical pole framework looked structurally unsound compared to heavy log joints. The portable nature of tipi construction seemed to violate basic principles of permanent architecture. Trading post operators throughout the territory echoed similar sentiments in their correspondence with suppliers and family members back east. These commercial intermediaries between white and native communities generally respected indigenous knowledge about hunting, trading, and seasonal migration patterns, yet they consistently described tipi dwelling as foolishly unprepared for serious winter conditions. Letters home frequently mentioned Indians still living in tents while civilized people built proper houses with solid walls and reliable heating systems. Newspaper accounts from territorial towns reinforced the conventional wisdom through regular commentary about native housing inadequacy. The Bismarck Tribune published editorials questioning why federal agencies tolerated continued tipi use when government funds could build proper log cabins that would demonstrate American building superiority. The Miles City Daily Press described visiting Cheyenne winter camps as depressing spectacles of people clinging to primitive shelter methods that endangered their families' survival. Even sympathetic observers who respected Plains tribes' hunting expertise and seasonal knowledge expressed concern about winter housing choices. Frontier missionaries regularly reported that Native families refused offers of cabin shelter, preferring to trust their lives to buffalo hide and wooden poles during months when temperatures routinely dropped below zero. These religious intermediaries genuinely worried about indigenous families' survival prospects when harsh weather arrived. The mockery intensified as autumn 1880 advanced toward winter. October snow began falling at Standing Rock while Lakota families continued their traditional preparations, gathering lodge poles and preparing buffalo hides according to techniques refined over generations. McLaughlin watched these activities with growing frustration, convinced that stubborn adherence to outdated methods would lead to tragedy when real cold arrived. He wrote to his wife describing the situation as potentially catastrophic, predicting that spring would bring graves for families who refused to abandon their inadequate shelters. Military reports from Fort Keogh documented similar concerns about native winter preparations occurring near the installation. Officers observed Cheyenne and Lakota families erecting teepees according to traditional methods, while Army engineers completed barracks construction using regulation specifications designed for frontier conditions. The official assessment concluded that indigenous families were choosing cultural tradition over survival necessity, creating potential humanitarian crisis when severe weather tested everyone's shelter adequacy. As November temperatures began their steady descent toward winter's depths, the stage was set for nature's ultimate test of competing building philosophies. Two approaches to cold weather survival would face the harshest winter conditions on record, and only one would prove adequate for human survival on the northern plains. What McLaughlin and the military engineers failed to recognize was the sophisticated thermal engineering hidden within what appeared to be simple buffalo hide construction. The Lakota teepee represented 15 generations of systematic refinement, with each design element serving multiple functions that European building traditions had never needed to address. Where settlers saw primitive tent construction, Plains tribes had developed advanced climate control systems that outperformed any frontier architecture through precise understanding of heat transfer, air circulation, and structural dynamics. The foundation of Tipi, thermal efficiency lay in its two-layer construction system that created a 4 to 6 inch dead airspace between the outer cover and inner liner. The outer cover, made from 10 to 12 buffalo hides sewn together with sinew, provided primary weather protection, while the inner liner extended 5 to 6 feet up from the ground level, creating what modern engineers would recognize as a thermal chimney effect. This inner wall system trapped warm air near the living space while allowing cold air to circulate harmlessly in the dead space between layers, maintaining interior temperature differential that log cabin construction could never achieve. Fresh buffalo hide, properly prepared with the fur turned inward during winter months, provided an R value of 8 to 10 compared to the R value of 3 achieved by standard 12-inch log cabin walls. The hide preparation process itself represented sophisticated material science, with Plains women selecting hides from animals killed during specific seasons when coat thickness maximized insulation properties. They scraped and treated the hides using techniques that preserved flexibility while enhancing thermal resistance, creating building material that adapted to temperature changes rather than fighting them. The Tipis' conical shape eliminated the thermal bridging problems that plagued rectangular log construction. Where cabin corners created cold air traps and log joints conducted exterior cold directly into interior spaces, the Tipis' curved walls distributed heat evenly throughout the living area. The mathematical precision of the cone angle, refined through centuries of experimentation, shed snow loads automatically while creating interior volume that maximized heating efficiency. 15 to 20 lodge poles, each selected from straight lodgepole pine measuring 20 to 25 feet in length, created a flexible geodesic framework that distributed structural loads without the rigid corner joints that failed under extreme temperature cycling. The smoke management system represented perhaps the most sophisticated element of Tipi engineering. 2 adjustable flaps at the apex, controlled by exterior poles, allowed precise regulation of interior airflow and heat retention. These smoke ears could be positioned to create draft that drew smoke cleanly from the central fire pit, while maintaining optimal interior temperature. The system worked by utilizing natural wind patterns and convection currents, with ground-level air intake occurring under the lifted cover edge and warm air exhaust through the carefully managed top opening. This created continuous air circulation that maintained breathable atmosphere while preventing heat loss through uncontrolled drafts. Fire pit positioning followed principles that European builders never understood. Rather than placing the heat source against an exterior wall like cabin fireplaces, Tipi fires burned in precisely calculated center positions that distributed radiant heat throughout the entire living space. The pit depth and diameter were standardized through generations of experience to optimize fuel consumption while maximizing heat distribution. Buffalo chips or wood burned in these central fires provided consistent warmth to every corner of the 300 square foot interior, eliminating the hot and cold zones that made cabin living uncomfortable and dangerous. Ground insulation techniques further enhanced Tipi thermal performance. Buffalo robes and specially prepared hides created insulating floor layers that prevented heat loss through ground contact while providing comfortable sleeping and sitting areas. The interior arrangement followed tested patterns that positioned sleeping areas in the warmest zones while reserving cooler areas for storage and activities that generated body heat. This spatial organization maximized the efficiency of every BTU generated by the central fire. McLaughlin's own cabin provided stark contrast to these refined systems. His 16 by 20 foot structure consumed 6 cords of split wood monthly, yet produced wildly uneven heating that left bedroom corners at 35 degrees while areas near the fireplace reached 80 degrees. The massive stone fireplace, built according to frontier standards, drew heated air directly up the chimney while pulling cold air through chinking gaps and around loose-fitting doors and windows. His rectangular construction created thermal bridges at every log joint, conducting exterior cold directly into interior spaces despite 12-inch wall thickness. The cabin's heating inefficiency stemmed from fundamental design flaws that Plains tribes had solved centuries earlier. McLaughlin's fireplace served as a heat sink that consumed enormous amounts of fuel while providing uneven warmth distribution. His rigid log construction expanded and contracted with temperature changes, opening gaps in the chinking that allowed continuous heat loss. The rectangular shape created dead air zones and corners where cold air settled and remained, making portions of the cabin uninhabitable during severe weather. Military barracks suffered from identical problems multiplied across larger spaces. Regulation construction specifications called for structures that could house multiple soldiers, yet the heating systems proved incapable of maintaining livable temperatures throughout the interior volume. Soldiers crowded around central stoves that consumed massive amounts of fuel while leaving sleeping areas too cold for comfortable rest. The standardized construction that worked adequately in moderate climates became dangerously inadequate when tested by Plains winter conditions. As November temperatures dropped towards zero, these contrasting approaches to cold weather survival prepared for their ultimate test. The thermal engineering that Plains tribes had perfected through 15 generations of northern winters would face the building, methods that European traditions considered superior. Only direct measurement of survival outcomes would determine which approach truly understood the principles of heat, insulation, and human comfort in one of North America's most challenging climates. December 15, 1880, brought the first warning of what meteorologists would later document as the most severe winter in Northern Plains history. Temperatures plummeted to 20 below zero and refused to climb above that mark for the next 43 days. By New Year's Day, 1881, the thermometer at Fort Abraham Lincoln registered 47 degrees below zero, with sustained winds of 35 miles per hour, creating wind chill conditions that made exposed skin freeze within minutes. Snowfall accumulated to depths of 4 to 6 feet across Dakota Territory, with drifts reaching 12 feet against any vertical obstruction. The crisis revealed the catastrophic inadequacy of Euro-American building methods with merciless precision. At Fort Abraham Lincoln, 40% of the officers' quarters became uninhabitable despite regulation construction that followed Army engineering specifications. Soldiers abandoned barracks where interior temperatures could not be maintained above freezing even with stoves burning continuously. Coal supplies, calculated for normal winter consumption, were exhausted by mid-January as desperate attempts to heat inadequate structures consumed fuel at rates that quartermasters had never anticipated. John Holtman's homestead, located 15 miles southeast of Bismarck, became a grim testament to the failure of conventional frontier building wisdom. Holtman had constructed his cabin according to standard practices, using 12-inch chinked logs with a massive stone fireplace that neighbors had praised as exemplary frontier architecture. His family of 5 had confidently prepared for their second Dakota winter, stockpiling what they calculated as adequate firewood and supplies. On January 22nd, Cavalry Patrol discovered the Holtman family frozen to death inside their properly built cabin after the fireplace chimney cracked under extreme temperature stress, filling the interior with deadly smoke while eliminating their only heat source. McLaughlin's own dwelling illustrated the systematic failure of European building principles under Plains winter conditions. His cabin, constructed with the best materials and techniques available to government agents, became increasingly unlivable as temperatures dropped. Ice formed on interior walls, despite fires that burned continuously day and night. Water froze solid in buckets placed within 6 feet of the fireplace. The massive stone chimney that was supposed to provide reliable heating instead created a thermal vacuum that drew heated air directly outside while pulling frigid air through every gap in the chinking. By early February, McLaughlin moved his family to the agency's main building where multiple families crowded together for survival warmth. Trading posts throughout the territory faced similar crises as their substantial log construction proved inadequate for extended extreme cold. The Henderson Trading Company post at Fort Berthold began burning furniture and floorboards when their firewood supply was exhausted 3 weeks earlier than anticipated. Interior temperatures never rose above 40 degrees, despite continuous fires that consumed every combustible material in the building. The post's thick log walls, chinked with mud and moss, according to frontier best practices, developed gaps as the wood contracted under temperature stress, creating drafts that made portions of the building uninhabitable. Military reports documented the systematic breakdown of standard heating and construction methods across the entire region. Fort Keogh's commanding officer filed emergency requisitions for additional fuel supplies after calculating that his barracks were consuming firewood at 4 times the normal rate while still failing to maintain livable temperatures. Soldiers were treated for frostbite injuries sustained while sleeping in regulation quarters. The post surgeon reported 12 cases of cold-related injuries among personnel who never left the fort's heated buildings, indicating that the structures themselves had become sources of danger rather than protection. The technical failures followed predictable patterns that revealed fundamental flaws in Euro-American cold weather construction. Log cabin thermal bridging allowed exterior cold to conduct directly through wall joints, creating interior cold zones that no amount of additional heating could eliminate. Rectangular construction trapped cold air in corners where it remained despite continuous fire heating. Heavy snow loads collapsed cabin roofs designed for moderate climate conditions, leaving families exposed to deadly conditions. Chinking materials contracted and failed under extreme temperature cycling, opening gaps that created deadly drafts throughout interior spaces. Massive fireplaces, considered the cornerstone of frontier heating systems, became liability rather than asset under extreme conditions. These heat sources consumed enormous quantities of fuel while creating dangerous temperature gradients that left sleeping areas uninhabitably cold. Chimney systems designed for moderate climates developed structural problems under temperature stress that made them dangerous to operate. The fireplace design that worked adequately during normal winters became inadequate when tested by conditions that demanded maximum thermal efficiency. Meanwhile, smoke continued to rise steadily from teepee camps throughout the territory, where Plains families maintained comfortable interior conditions using methods that white observers still dismissed as primitive. At Standing Rock Agency, Lakota families went about their daily routines inside warm lodges while government buildings became increasingly difficult to heat. The contrast was so stark that it challenged every assumption about civilized versus savage approaches to winter survival. Survival statistics from that winter painted an undeniable picture of building method effectiveness. Standing Rock Agency recorded 0 weather-related deaths among tipi-dwelling families during the entire extreme cold period. Fort Lincoln documented 12 soldiers treated for frostbite, with 3 cases resulting in permanent injury from cold exposure inside heated buildings. Surrounding homestead areas saw 23 families abandon their cabins to seek shelter at trading posts or military installations, with 7 homesteads permanently abandoned when their buildings proved uninhabitable. By February 1, 1881, the crisis had forced a fundamental reckoning with building philosophy across the northern plains. The winter that was supposed to prove European construction superiority had instead demonstrated its catastrophic inadequacy when tested by conditions that Plains tribes had survived successfully for countless generations. The question was no longer whether indigenous building methods were primitive, but whether Euro American construction knowledge was adequate for survival in the climate where it was being applied. The breaking point came on February 8, 1881, when Fort Keogh's commanding officer sent a formal dispatch to the nearby Cheyenne winter camp requesting emergency shelter assistance for military personnel. The message, delivered by a half-frozen cavalry trooper, marked the first official acknowledgement that Army engineering had failed catastrophically while indigenous building methods continued to provide reliable protection. Within hours of the request, Cheyenne families had erected 2 additional lodges specifically to house soldiers whose barracks had become uninhabitable despite continuous heating efforts. McLaughlin faced his own moment of reckoning 3 days later when his family's survival depended on abandoning decades of cultural assumptions about proper housing. His government-issued cabin, constructed according to federal specifications and heated with the best fuel available, could no longer sustain human life despite fires that burned around the clock. Swallowing pride that had sustained 4 years of dismissing indigenous knowledge, McLaughlin approached Chief Gall's camp with a request that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. He asked Lakota families for guidance on winter survival techniques that his own civilization had failed to provide. The response revealed cultural sophistication that contrasted sharply with Euro-American stereotypes about savage versus civilized behavior. Rather than gloating over white failures or demanding payment for life-saving knowledge, Lakota families immediately began sharing shelter and survival expertise with desperate government officials. Sitting, Bull's band made room for 3 settler families whose cabins had become death traps, providing not just emergency shelter, but systematic instruction in techniques that could mean the difference between survival and freezing. Inside a functioning 18-foot diameter tipi that housed Chief Gall's family of 6, McLaughlin experienced thermal efficiency that challenged everything he thought he understood about winter architecture. The interior temperature held steady at 65 degrees, while exterior conditions registered 42 below zero. A single armload of split wood burned for 4 to 5 hours, compared to his cabin's requirement for hourly fuel feeding that still failed to maintain livable temperatures. The smoke management system maintained clear air quality while the heating efficiency created comfortable conditions throughout the entire living space. Lakota women began demonstrating liner installation techniques to Fort officers' wives who had spent months shivering in supposedly superior government housing. The instruction revealed sophisticated understanding of thermal barriers and air circulation that Army engineers had never considered. The inner liner system, positioned to create precise air gaps and convection patterns, transformed simple buffalo hide construction into advanced climate control that outperformed the most expensive frontier building methods. Military engineers trained to dismiss indigenous technology as primitive found themselves documenting tipi construction principles with the methodical precision they typically reserve for regulation building projects. Captain William Thompson began measuring and recording thermal efficiency data that contradicted every assumption about savage versus civilized architecture. His calculations showed that properly constructed tipis maintained 40-degree temperature differentials while consuming 70% less fuel than comparable barracks space. The teaching process revealed layers of sophistication that white observers had systematically overlooked. Buffalo hide selection followed precise criteria based on seasonal timing, animal age, and preparation techniques that maximized insulation properties. Pole selection required understanding of wood grain, flexibility requirements, and load distribution that prevented structural failure under extreme conditions. Assembly sequences demanded coordination between multiple specialists who understood engineering principles through generations of practical application. Wind load management principles demonstrated during February storms with sustained gusts exceeding 40 miles per hour showed how flexible construction could outperform rigid building methods. Where log cabins developed structural stress that opened gaps and created dangerous drafts, tipi frameworks bent with wind forces while maintaining structural integrity. The conical shape that settlers had mocked as unstable actually provided superior aerodynamic performance that eliminated the pressure differentials destroying rectangular buildings. Fuel efficiency demonstrations provided measurable proof of indigenous engineering superiority. A standard tip-eye fire, burning in the optimally positioned central pit, provided consistent heating throughout 300 square feet of living space while consuming one-third the wood required by cabin fireplaces. The thermal distribution achieved through radiant heating from the center eliminated cold zones and hot spots that made cabin living uncomfortable and inefficient. Cultural bridge moments occurred throughout the crisis as survival necessity overwhelmed racial prejudice and institutional arrogance. White families who had spent years dismissing indigenous knowledge as backward superstition now sought instruction in techniques that meant the difference between life and death. The exchanges revealed not just building technology, but philosophical approaches to environmental adaptation that challenged Euro-American assumptions about conquering versus cooperating with natural conditions. Army engineers began systematic documentation of indigenous thermal management principles that would eventually influence military construction standards. Captain Thompson's detailed measurements showed that tipis achieved superior heating efficiency through design elements that worked with natural forces rather than fighting them. Air circulation patterns, heat distribution methods, and structural flexibility represented engineering solutions that European traditions had never developed. The data collection process revealed the scientific method underlying indigenous building practices. Generations of systematic observation had refined construction techniques through testing that was more rigorous than anything European builders had applied to frontier conditions. Each design element had been optimized through survival experience that eliminated methods which failed and preserved techniques that worked under the harshest possible conditions. Trading post operators, whose commercial success depended on objective assessment of what actually worked, began documenting the performance differences they observed between building methods. Their records showed dramatic contrasts in heating costs, structural integrity, and operational capability between indigenous and Euro-American construction approaches. The business implications were clear. Buildings that actually worked in plains conditions represented superior investment regardless of cultural assumptions about primitive versus civilized methods. By mid-February, the crisis had forced fundamental reassessment of building philosophy across the northern plains. The winter that was supposed to demonstrate European construction superiority had instead proven the advanced engineering sophistication of indigenous building traditions that white society had systematically dismissed and suppressed. The transformation began before spring thaw had even started. By March 1881, Fort Keogh had established formal protocols incorporating indigenous shelter techniques into military emergency procedures. The commanding officer issued orders requiring all personnel to receive instruction in tipi construction methods, recognizing that survival in plains conditions demanded knowledge that regulation Army engineering had failed to provide. Supply requisitions included buffalo hides and lodge poles alongside standard building materials, marking the first official acknowledgement that indigenous technology offered superior performance under extreme weather conditions. Captain Thompson's detailed thermal efficiency reports, filed with the Army Corps of Engineers in Washington, documented measurable advantages that challenged fundamental assumptions about civilized versus primitive construction. His data showed that properly erected tipis maintained interior temperatures 40 degrees warmer than exterior conditions while consuming 70% less fuel than comparable barracks space. Wind resistance tests conducted during February storms demonstrated that flexible pole frameworks withstood 60-mile-per-hour gusts that damaged rigid log construction throughout the territory. Settlers across Dakota Territory began incorporating tipi design elements into their building projects with modifications that adapted indigenous principles to Euro American materials and construction methods. The Johnson family, rebuilding after their original cabin proved uninhabitable, constructed what neighbors called a hybrid lodge that combined teepee thermal management with log wall construction. Their new structure featured a conical roof design for automatic snow shedding, double wall construction copying the teepee liner system, and centralized heating that distributed warmth throughout the living space, rather than creating dangerous hot and cold zones. Trading posts, driven by commercial necessity to maintain operations regardless of weather conditions, quickly adopted building modifications based on indigenous engineering principles. The Henderson Trading Company rebuilt their Fort Berthold post with a teepee-inspired conical roof structure that shed snow loads automatically while incorporating smoke management principles that eliminated the drafting problems that had made their original building uninhabitable. Interior modifications included centralized heating systems and double wall construction that reduced fuel consumption by 40% while maintaining consistent temperatures throughout the trading floor. McLaughlin's personal transformation proved most dramatic among government officials who had spent years dismissing indigenous knowledge as obstacles to civilization progress. His 1882 annual report to Washington described Plains tribal building methods as advanced engineering applications worthy of systematic study and adoption. He documented specific construction techniques with the same methodical precision he had previously applied to criticizing indigenous housing practices, noting thermal efficiency measurements and structural performance data that supported official policy changes. The winter of 1881 to 1882 provided the first test of adapted construction methods based on indigenous principles. Settler survival rates increased 300% in regions where hybrid building techniques had been implemented. Fuel consumption dropped an average of 40% in structures incorporating tipi thermal management systems. Snow load failures decreased 80% among buildings using conical roof designs that automatically shed accumulation rather than requiring dangerous manual snow removal from flat or peaked surfaces. Military construction standards underwent systematic revision based on documented indigenous engineering superiority. The Army Corps of Engineers published climate-adapted construction methods for frontier applications in 1883, officially recognizing indigenous thermal management as advanced technology worthy of military adoption. The manual included detailed instructions for implementing tipi-inspired heating systems, flexible foundation concepts, and wind-resistant structural designs that had proven superior to regulation construction under extreme conditions. Educational institutions began incorporating indigenous building knowledge into architecture and engineering curricula after frontier survival statistics demonstrated the practical superiority of native construction methods. The Colorado School of Engineering added courses in climate-appropriate building design that featured plains teepee construction as a case study in thermal efficiency and structural optimization. Students learned to calculate heat transfer coefficients and wind load distributions using examples from indigenous engineering that outperformed contemporary Euro-American building practices. Scientific documentation of tipi thermal efficiency reached the Smithsonian Institution, where researchers began systematic study of indigenous construction methods as legitimate engineering applications rather than primitive cultural artifacts. Detailed measurements confirmed historical accounts of superior heating performance, with properly constructed tipis achieving R values of 8 to 10 compared to standard log cabin R values of 3 to 4. Structural load testing verified that flexible pole frameworks could withstand environmental stresses that destroyed rigid building construction. Government policy shifted from forced assimilation programs that suppressed indigenous knowledge toward selective adoption of native techniques that demonstrated practical superiority. The Bureau of Indian Affairs began documenting traditional building methods rather than suppressing them, recognizing that Plains tribes possessed engineering knowledge that could benefit Euro-American settlement efforts. Policy directives encouraged cultural exchange that allowed indigenous construction expertise to inform frontier building practices. McLaughlin's correspondence during the 1880s reflected his complete philosophical reversal regarding indigenous knowledge and civilized building methods. His 1885 letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs stated, "We came to teach civilization and learned instead that true civilization adapts to its environment rather than fighting it. Plains tribes have developed building technologies through centuries of scientific observation that exceed anything our own engineering traditions have produced for these climate conditions. The broader recognition extended beyond immediate frontier applications as energy conservation became a concern during later economic crises. The 1870s economic depression had highlighted fuel costs and heating efficiency as significant household expenses, making indigenous thermal management techniques valuable for economic as well as survival reasons. Urban architects began studying Plains tipi construction for applications in cold climate housing that could reduce heating costs while maintaining comfortable living conditions. Modern vindication would come during the 1970s energy crisis when architects rediscovered indigenous thermal efficiency principles that had been largely forgotten after frontier conditions improved. Contemporary testing confirmed historical accounts of tipi heating performance, with properly constructed lodges outperforming most 20th century housing for energy efficiency per square foot of living space. NASA's Space Habitat Research Program studied tipi aerodynamics and thermal management for potential Mars settlement applications, recognizing that Plains tribes had solved engineering problems that remain challenges for modern space exploration. The measured legacy of that harsh winter lived on in museum displays, engineering textbooks, and architectural applications that honored indigenous knowledge as sophisticated engineering rather than primitive cultural practice. The National Museum of Natural History featured a full-scale Lakota teepee with detailed explanations of thermal efficiency principles that had once been dismissed as savage superstition, but were now recognized as advanced scientific applications developed through systematic observation and testing across generations of environmental challenge.